Max was no ordinary dog, though no one in the quiet little town really knew his story. To most of the people who saw him walking down the street beside his owner, a retired firefighter named George, he was just a gentle, well-behaved German shepherd with a calm look in his eyes. He didn't bark wildly like other dogs, he didn't chase after squirrels, and he didn't pull on the leash. Instead, he walked with quiet discipline, his head high, his steps steady, and his eyes always alert. Children in the neighborhood loved to run up to him, hug his neck, and pat his head, and Max accepted it with patience, never snapping, never pulling away. Parents often said to George, "You've trained him so well. He must be the easiest dog in the world to raise." George would only smile. He knew he hadn't trained Max that way. Max had come into his life already carrying a sense of order that George could never quite explain. George had found Max 12 years earlier, after retiring from the fire department. He had wanted companionship but didn't expect much when he visited the local adoption shelter. The staff told him Max was a retired working dog, but never shared details about what that meant. All George was told was that Max was disciplined, obedient, and already trained with certain commands. That was enough for George, who simply wanted a dog that would be loyal and good company during his peaceful years of retirement. He brought Max home without asking too many questions, and over time they became inseparable. But George often noticed things about Max that puzzled him. For example, Max never slept heavily like most dogs. Even late at night, if a car door slammed 2 streets away, Max would lift his head and stare toward the sound. If George reached for a flashlight or a tool suddenly, Max would instantly shift his posture as though waiting for instructions. And whenever a news program on television played clips of soldiers marching, helicopters flying, or radios crackling, Max would freeze. His ears would stand tall, his body would stiffen, and his eyes would follow the screen carefully. George thought it was odd, but he didn't think too hard about it. He simply believed Max was extra alert, maybe from a past life as a rescue dog. Life in the town was simple and quiet. George took Max for walks every morning and evening, and the two of them became familiar figures around the neighborhood. Max's gentle nature meant that children often ran up to him without fear. There was a little boy named Tommy who lived down the street who especially loved Max. Tommy would race across the yard whenever he saw George and Max coming, and Max would sit down calmly, letting the boy wrap his arms around his neck. "This dog's a hero," Tommy would say proudly, even though he didn't know why he felt that way. His parents would laugh and agree, thinking it was just a child's imagination. But there was something in Max's eyes that always seemed to match those words. He carried himself like a quiet guardian, never boastful but never careless. George often talked to Max as though he were a person. Sitting on the porch in the evenings, George would sip his tea while Max lay at his feet. He would say things like, "You know, buddy, sometimes I think you understand more than anyone else." Max would lift his head, ears twitching, as if he really did understand. Sometimes George gave strange commands without meaning to, like pointing with 2 fingers or tapping the ground in a certain rhythm. And to his surprise, Max would react instantly. Once, when George dropped his keys near the car, he tapped his hand without thinking, and Max bent down, picked them up carefully with his mouth, and placed them in George's palm. George stared, stunned. "Who taught you that?" he asked aloud. Max only wagged his tail, eyes calm as if saying nothing needed to be explained. The truth was that Max had once lived a very different life, though George had no idea. Behind those calm eyes and disciplined movements lay years of training, missions, and loyalty. But Max never showed off his past. He simply lived quietly day after day, like an old soldier who no longer needed to prove himself. He was content to guard George's home, play gently with the children, and walk steadily through the town. The people around him thought they were seeing everything, but they were only seeing the surface. One afternoon, George's neighbor, Mrs. Hill, stopped by with a plate of cookies. She watched Max lying near George's rocking chair, his head resting on his paws but his eyes sharp, scanning every movement on the street. "That dog of yours is something else," she said. "He's got the eyes of a watchman. Doesn't miss a thing," George chuckled. "Yeah, he's like a second pair of eyes for me. Sometimes I think he sees danger before I do." Mrs. Hill nodded. "I believe it. You know, animals remember things. Maybe he had a life before this one that taught him how to stay alert." George looked at Max for a long moment. He wondered what she meant, but he brushed the thought aside. To him, Max was simply the best companion he could ask for, and that was enough. As years passed, Max grew older, but he never lost that sharpness. His fur became touched with gray, his movements slower, but his eyes stayed the same. Calm, watchful, ready. Even the veterinarian remarked once, "This is one of the most disciplined dogs I've ever seen. He doesn't resist when I examine him, doesn't flinch, doesn't panic. It's rare." George only smiled, proud of his companion but still unaware of the deeper truth. He thought Max was just gifted with an unusual personality. In reality, the dog was carrying a history George could never imagine. Max's presence became so natural in the community that people forgot to wonder about his past. They only knew him as the loyal German shepherd who belonged to George. But sometimes, when George sat quietly on the porch, he caught himself thinking, "What did you go through, old boy? What makes you sit so straight? What makes you follow orders I didn't give?" He would stroke Max's fur gently, whispering, "Whatever it was, you're safe now." And Max would press his head into George's hand, a silent thank you, though deep inside part of him was always ready for the day when the past would no longer stay hidden. That day had not yet come, but it was waiting just ahead. For now, Max remained the quiet guardian of the town, a dog who seemed ordinary but carried in his heart the memory of another life. No one knew the truth. Not George, not the children, not the neighbors. But the truth always has a way of returning, even after 12 long years. Many years before Max became the quiet guardian of a small town, his life had been far different. Back then, he wasn't known as Max at all. He had another name, one whispered in training camps and spoken with pride by men who trusted him with their lives. He was a Navy SEAL K-9, trained to work in the most dangerous places, standing side by side with soldiers who depended on his sharp senses more than any piece of equipment. His story began when he was just a young pup with sharp eyes and endless energy. Trainers quickly noticed that he was different from the others. While most puppies ran around aimlessly, chasing after toys and tumbling over each other, he focused. His ears turned to every sound, his nose followed every trail, and his body obeyed commands almost before they were spoken. It was as if he was born to serve. From the very beginning, his training was intense. He learned to track scents across fields, through forests, and even across water. He learned to sit silently for hours, waiting for a signal. He learned to leap from helicopters with his handler, strapped safely in special gear. The world of noise, danger, and discipline became his normal. Where other dogs might panic at the sound of gunfire, he remained steady, eyes locked on his handler, waiting for the next order. He was taught to detect hidden threats, to alert silently, to move fast but with precision. Every day his skills grew sharper, and the men around him grew to trust him like a brother. For them, he was not just a dog, he was a teammate. His closest bond was with his handler, a Navy SEAL named Ryan. Ryan was strong, calm, and patient, and he treated the dog not as property, but as a partner. The two of them developed an unspoken language, a tilt of Ryan's hand, a certain movement of his eyes, even a subtle shift of his body. These were enough for the dog to understand what needed to be done. The bond was built on trust, long nights of training, and missions where one mistake could cost lives. Ryan often whispered to him during quiet moments, "You're my shadow. You never leave my side." And the dog never did. Together they went on missions that the world would never hear about. In deserts, mountains, and cities far away, they worked as one. The dog's nose could find hidden dangers no machine could detect. His ears caught sounds in the distance long before human soldiers could hear them. Time after time, he helped save lives. Ryan and his teammates called him their silent hero, the one who gave them a chance to return home. Every man in the unit respected him, not only because of his skills but because of his courage. He faced the same dangers they did without hesitation, but even heroes face limits. During one mission, an explosion changed everything. The dog had been leading the way, detecting hidden threats when a blast went off nearby. Though he survived, he was injured. His body was strong, but the years of service and the toll of the injury made it clear to the handlers and commanders that it was time for him to retire. The hardest part was saying goodbye to Ryan. The handler knelt beside him, tears hidden behind strong eyes, and whispered, "You've done more than enough. You deserve peace now." The dog pressed his head into Ryan's chest as though understanding. It was the end of one chapter, though neither of them knew how much that goodbye would linger in their hearts. When he was retired from service, his military records were quietly sealed. For security and safety, not all dogs' pasts were shared with the public. Instead, he was given a chance to be adopted into a civilian home. That was when George, the retired firefighter, unknowingly became part of his story. George thought he was adopting just a retired working dog, but in truth, he was bringing home a decorated veteran who had once served in silence beside some of the bravest men in the world. The dog's new life began under the name Max, and slowly the years of quiet routine replaced the memory of roaring helicopters and urgent commands. Still, the instincts never left him. They were buried deep inside, waiting. In his new life, Max seemed content, but sometimes memories returned like echoes. The sound of fireworks on the 4th of July made him sit up sharply, scanning the sky. The crackling of a police radio in a neighbor's car made him freeze, ears locked forward as though waiting for instructions. George often wondered why Max was so different from other dogs. He never whined for attention, never destroyed furniture, never acted restless. He simply carried himself with the calmness of someone who had seen the world and now chose peace. The townspeople found it charming, but they could not understand that this calmness came from years of discipline, from missions that had shaped him into something rare. As time passed, the younger generation in town grew up with Max as part of the background of their lives. Children played around him, teenagers patted his head as they passed, and adults greeted him with admiration, but none of them guessed who he really was. To them, he was just Max, George's loyal companion. They never knew about the medals he had once earned, or the lives he had helped save. Those stories stayed hidden, locked away with Ryan and the SEALs who had once trusted him with everything. Ryan never forgot, though. Even after he moved on from active duty, he often thought of his four-legged partner. He wondered where he was, if he was healthy, if he was safe. He hoped that the dog had found a good home, where he could live his remaining years in peace. The bond between them was not something that faded easily. It was the kind of connection that could last across time and distance. Ryan always told himself that if fate ever brought them back together, he would recognize him instantly. Back in the small town, George sometimes caught himself staring at Max with curiosity. "You've got secrets, don't you, old boy?" he would say quietly while rubbing the dog's ears. Max would look back with calm eyes as though he wanted to answer but chose silence. George never pressed further. He didn't need to know the past to love him. To George, Max was perfect as he was. But life has a way of circling back, of connecting past and present in ways no one expects. For Max, the quiet years of hiding his past were about to end, because one day something would happen in that town that would wake the soldier inside him again. The town had always been quiet, the kind of place where neighbors trusted one another and children played safely in the fields. But one autumn evening, that peace was shaken. A young girl named Lily, only 8 years old, didn't return home after school. Her parents thought at first that she was playing at a friend's house, but when darkness began to fall and no one had seen her, worry turned into panic. Word spread quickly. People came out of their homes with flashlights calling Lily's name, searching the woods and the streets. The sheriff organized a search party, but hours passed with no sign of her. The air grew heavy with fear. George was sitting on his porch with Max when the news reached him. His neighbor, out of breath, said, "Lily's missing. Everyone's out looking." George immediately stood up, his heart racing. Max, lying at his feet, had already sensed the tension. He stood before George, even gave a command, his body stiff, ears pointed forward, eyes sharp. George hesitated for a moment, then grabbed his jacket and flashlight. "All right, boy," he whispered. "Let's go help." As they reached the gathering crowd, George noticed how restless Max was. The dog wasn't barking or running in circles like other dogs might, but he kept sniffing the air, turning his head sharply as though catching something invisible. He pulled at the leash, not with impatience but with direction, as if he knew where to go. George was surprised. He had never seen Max behave like this. The sheriff, noticing, said, "George, let him try. Maybe he can track her." George nodded slowly, still unsure, but unclipped the leash. The moment Max was free, his whole body seemed to change. The calm pet that everyone knew vanished, replaced by something sharper, more focused, almost professional. He lowered his nose to the ground, sniffed carefully, then lifted his head, eyes fixed toward the edge of the woods. Without hesitation, he moved, not wildly, but with precise steps. George and the sheriff followed closely, calling out instructions to the searchers. "Stay with him," the sheriff ordered. It was as if Max had been waiting for this moment all his life. His instincts, buried for 12 quiet years, came alive in an instant. He moved with purpose, pausing to sniff, then charging forward, ears alert. George felt chills. He had always thought of Max as disciplined, yes, but this was something different. This was training, deep and exact, showing itself in every move. The woods were dark and thick, but Max never faltered. His tail was stiff. His body leaned forward and his nose brushed the ground as he tracked a scent no one else could sense. The search party stumbled behind, calling Lily's name, shining lights, but Max ignored the noise. He was working, fully locked in. He stopped at a tree, sniffed around, then circled. George saw claw marks on the bark as though a child had tried to climb. His heart pounded. "She was here," he whispered. The sheriff knelt, shining his light. "Fresh marks," he said. "We're on the right trail." Max was already moving again, pulling ahead, leading them deeper into the woods. Every few steps he paused, sniffed the air, then adjusted his path slightly, making sure he was right. The men behind him exchanged glances. None of them had ever seen a dog work like this. It was as if he had done it 1,000 times before. As the night grew colder, some of the searchers began to lose hope. But Max showed no sign of slowing. George followed, breathless, his flashlight trembling in his hand. He kept whispering, "Good boy, Max, keep going." Deep down, though, he felt a mixture of pride and confusion. How could his dog know so much? How could he be so exact, so fearless? It was a side of Max that George had never fully seen. Then suddenly Max stopped. His ears twitched, his nose lifted high, sniffing the air. He froze, one paw raised. George felt the hairs on his arms stand up. "What is it, boy?" he asked. Max gave a low, controlled whine and then looked sharply to the left. Without waiting, he darted forward, faster now, weaving through the trees. The sheriff shouted, "Follow him!" and the searchers ran behind. After several tense minutes, Max stopped again, barking once, sharp and commanding. Ahead, near an old fallen log, they heard a faint cry. The searchers rushed forward and found Lily huddled, frightened but safe. She had gotten lost, tried to climb a tree, then panicked and hidden, too scared to move in the dark. Tears filled her parents' eyes as they reached her. She clung to them, sobbing. The whole crowd erupted in relief, voices crying out in joy. George fell to his knees beside Max, hugging him tightly. "You did it, boy," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You found her." The sheriff patted Max's head, stunned. "That's no ordinary dog," he said quietly. "That's a professional." Everyone around nodded, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. The calm, quiet dog they thought they knew had turned into a rescuer, guiding them exactly where they needed to go. Word spread quickly through the town. People couldn't stop talking about how Max had led them straight to Lily. Some said it was luck, others said it was instinct. But George knew it was more than that. He had seen the change in Max's eyes, the precision of his movements, the way he worked as if following training. For the first time, George wondered seriously about Max's past. Who had trained him? What had he been before he came into his life? That night, as George sat with Max on the porch, the town still buzzing with relief, he whispered, "There's more to you than I'll ever know, isn't there?" Max sat upright, eyes scanning the horizon, calm but alert, as if waiting for another mission. George stroked his fur slowly. "You're a hero, old boy. You've always been one, haven't you?" Max didn't answer, of course, but in his silence there was truth. The town celebrated Lily's safe return, and Max became the center of attention. People came by to pat his head, thank George, and tell the story again and again. But George noticed something deeper. Whenever people crowded around, Max stayed polite but distant. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't excited by the praise. Instead, he stood calmly, almost professionally, as though he understood that this was simply his duty. That night's mission had awakened something inside him, something that had never really gone away. For 12 years, Max had lived quietly, hiding his past in the shadows of ordinary life. But now that past was beginning to show itself little by little. The people of the town saw a loyal dog. George saw a mystery. But soon someone else, someone from Max's old world, would see him for who he truly was. And when that moment came, the word spoken would change everything. Call him back. The morning after Lily was found, the town was still talking about Max. At the small cafe near the main street, people gathered to share the story again and again. Some called him a miracle dog. Others said it was his sharp instincts, but everyone agreed that without Max, the little girl might not have been found so quickly. George tried to stay humble, saying only, "He's a good dog, always has been." But deep inside he was unsettled. He had seen something in Max's eyes that night, a fire that had been hidden for years. It wasn't just instinct. It was training, discipline, and something more. That same week, a man arrived in town. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and walked with the posture of someone who had spent years in uniform. His name was Ryan, though few people knew it at first. He was a retired Navy SEAL who had come to visit a friend nearby. While passing through, he overheard the story of a German shepherd who had led townspeople to a missing child. The details made him pause. A disciplined shepherd, calm, precise, responding as if trained. A thought flashed in his mind, almost too strong to ignore. Could it be? Ryan had once served alongside a canine partner who was unmatched in courage and skill. That dog had been retired after an injury, and Ryan had never stopped thinking about him. They had shared countless missions, and the bond between them had been like no other. The idea that the dog could be alive, living quietly in a town like this, felt impossible. Yet something inside Ryan pushed him to see for himself. That evening, Ryan made his way to George's home. Max was lying on the porch, calm as ever, when Ryan approached. The moment Max lifted his head, something electric passed between them. His ears twitched, his eyes focused sharply on the stranger. Ryan froze, staring at the dog. He whispered softly, almost not believing his own words, "It's you, isn't it?" George stood puzzled. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked politely. Ryan nodded slowly. "I'm sorry to bother you. My name's Ryan. I heard about what your dog did for the little girl. I think I know him." George frowned. "Know him?" "He was adopted from a shelter years ago. They said he was a retired working dog, but they never told me much more." Ryan knelt slowly in front of Max. The dog's eyes never left him. Ryan lifted his hand, making a subtle motion that only someone from his past would know. Max responded instantly, shifting his posture, ears locked forward, waiting for the next cue. George gasped. "What in the world?" Ryan's voice trembled. "I knew it. This isn't just any dog. This is Shadow, my partner, my teammate." His eyes filled with emotion as he turned to George. "We served together. He's a Navy SEAL dog. He saved lives overseas countless times. And now he's here." George was stunned. He looked at Max with new eyes, realizing that the mysteries of the past 12 years were beginning to make sense. The way Max responded to commands he'd never taught, the way he carried himself like a soldier, the way he found Lily so quickly, it was all part of his hidden history. Ryan looked back at Max and gave a quiet command, one he hadn't spoken in years. "Call him back." The words carried power, not just as a command but as a bond between them. Max's body stiffened, his eyes sharp, and he moved with precision, sitting upright exactly as he once had during missions. The townspeople who had gathered nearby gasped. They had never seen anything like it. The calm family dog they thought they knew transformed before their eyes into a disciplined warrior. Tears blurred Ryan's vision. He reached out, placing a hand gently on Max's head. "You never forgot, did you, buddy?" Max pressed his head into Ryan's chest, a gesture of recognition and love. For a moment, time seemed to disappear. It was as if the 12 years apart had been erased and they were back on the field, partners once again. George, though deeply moved, felt a tug in his chest. He had lived with Max for 12 years, loving him as family, believing he was simply a loyal companion. Now, learning about his past, George realized Max was much more than he had ever imagined. Yet George also knew that none of this changed how much he cared for him. He whispered, "You're still my boy, Max. No matter what your name used to be, you're mine now." The sheriff, who had come to see what the commotion was about, shook his head in disbelief. "You're telling me this dog used to be Navy? No wonder he tracked Lily like that. No wonder he's different." He looked at George and Ryan, then at Max. This town had no idea who was living among us. Word spread even faster now. Max was no longer just the hero who saved a child. He was revealed as a decorated veteran, a dog who had once served with one of the most elite units in the world. People came to see him, to thank him, to take pictures. But through it all, Max stayed calm, humble, never barking for attention or showing off. It was as if he knew he had done his duty once, and fame was not what he needed. Ryan stayed a few more days in town, visiting George and Max daily. He shared stories of their missions, speaking softly so only George could hear. He described the times Max had alerted them to danger just in time, how he had once saved an entire squad by detecting a hidden trap, how he had leapt from helicopters into unknown fields without fear. Each story made George look at Max with deeper respect. This was not just a dog. This was a warrior who had carried burdens few could imagine. One evening, George asked quietly, "Do you think he misses it? The life you shared?" Ryan smiled sadly. "He doesn't miss the danger. Dogs don't crave war, but the bond, the teamwork, the sense of mission, yes, that stays with them. That's why he found Lily. The mission woke something in him again. Once a SEAL, always a SEAL." George nodded slowly, tears in his eyes. "I feel blessed, you know. For 12 years I thought he was just my companion. Now I realize he's a hero who chose to live quietly with me." He looked at Max with love. "I'll make sure the rest of his days are peaceful, but I'll never forget who he really is." That night, Max lay between George and Ryan, his body relaxed, his breathing steady. But his ears twitched at every sound. His eyes flickered open at every movement. Even in rest, the warrior inside him never fully left. George understood that now. The past might have been hidden for 12 years, but it had never truly disappeared. And with one command, call him back, the truth had returned. The night after Ryan's visit, George sat on the porch with Max at his side. The air was cool, the sky sprinkled with stars, and the town had finally grown quiet after days of excitement. George stroked Max's fur slowly, thinking about everything he had learned. For 12 years, he had lived with a dog he thought was ordinary. Now he knew the truth. Max had once been a Navy SEAL K-9, a decorated veteran who had saved countless lives. The realization made George feel both proud and humbled. He whispered softly,
"You've been a hero all along, old boy."
"And you never even told me." Max turned his head, resting it on George's knee, his eyes calm but knowing. The town continued to celebrate Max in its own way. Neighbors brought treats, children drew pictures of him, and Lily's parents came every day just to say thank you again. They told George, "Your dog gave us back our daughter. We'll never forget that." Lily herself often sat on the porch with Max, reading her picture books aloud as though he understood every word. Max listened patiently, tail wagging slightly. To him, this was enough. He didn't need medals or ceremonies. The love of a child, the peace of a quiet home, and the gentle hand of his owner were all he needed now. Ryan, before leaving town, stopped one last time to see Max. He knelt down, his voice low and filled with emotion. "You were the best partner I ever had," he said. "And I'm glad to see you living like this. You've earned it." He turned to George. "Take care of him. He may still have the heart of a soldier, but he deserves the life of a friend now." George nodded, his eyes misty. "Don't worry. He'll never want for anything." Ryan placed his hand on Max's head, then whispered one final command softly, almost like a secret. "Stand down." Max responded instantly, sitting tall, ears perked, then slowly lowering into a calm position. His eyes locked on Ryan until he stood and walked away. Life slowly returned to normal after that. The story of Max became part of the town's memory, told and retold whenever people gathered. Some said he was proof that heroes walk among us quietly. Others said he was a gift, a reminder that courage can be found in the most unexpected places. George simply saw him as his loyal companion, though in his heart he now understood the depth of Max's spirit. He treated him with the same love as always, but now there was an added layer of respect, as if he were living with an old soldier who had chosen peace. Max himself seemed unchanged. He still walked calmly through the streets, still let children pet him, still lay on the porch watching the world go by. But George noticed small things now that he hadn't before. The way Max scanned the horizon when they walked at dusk. The way he paused at sounds others didn't hear. The way his body shifted, ready when George lifted his arm suddenly. These were not habits of an ordinary dog. They were reminders of the life he had lived, the training that had shaped him, the missions that had carved discipline into his very being. Yet Max never boasted, never demanded recognition. He simply carried it within him quietly. One afternoon, George took Max to the park where children played soccer. Max sat beside him, watching the game with alert eyes. A boy tripped and began to cry, and without being asked, Max walked over, sat down beside him, and pressed his head against the boy's arm until he stopped crying. Parents smiled, whispering about how special he was. George chuckled softly. He thought about how Max had once faced danger, explosions and missions in faraway lands. And now here he was, comforting a child with the same calmness. "You really are one of a kind," George said aloud. The seasons passed and Max grew older, his steps slower, his fur grayer. But his spirit never faded. Every day George reminded himself that he was lucky. He had not just adopted a dog, he had been given a gift, a chance to live beside a true hero. Sometimes in the evenings, George would pull out a notebook and write little stories about Max, about the day he found Lily, about the way he responded to Ryan's command, about the calm dignity he carried everywhere. He wanted to leave behind a record so that even when Max was gone, people would remember him. One evening, George found himself reflecting on something Ryan had said. Once a seal, always a seal. He realized it was true. Even though Max had lived 12 quiet years in town, his heart had never changed. When the moment came, he rose to the mission without hesitation. And yet what made Max truly remarkable wasn't just his past as a SEAL. It was the way he had chosen to live afterward, with patience, gentleness, and humility. His greatest victory wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the way he gave love to children, comfort to families, and peace to George. The townspeople continued to admire Max, but eventually the excitement faded into memory. To most, he became once again just George's loyal dog, the calm shepherd they saw on walks. But those who had been there the night Lily was found never forgot. They would always remember the way he had led them, the way he had moved with precision, the way he had seemed to carry an invisible strength. For them, Max was proof that heroes sometimes hide in plain sight, waiting quietly until the world needs them again. As the years went on, George often wondered how many lives Max had saved before he came into his home. The number didn't matter, really. What mattered was the life they shared now, sitting on the porch, drinking tea, taking slow walks, watching sunsets together. These were the missions Max chose in his final chapter. And George knew that when people looked back on the story of their town, Max's name would always be spoken with honor. On a quiet spring evening, George leaned down and whispered, "You've given enough, old friend. Rest easy. You'll always be remembered." Max closed his eyes, his head resting on George's lap, his body at peace. He was a soldier, a guardian, a companion, and above all, a hero who had given everything without asking for anything in return. And so, the story of the canine dog who hid his SEAL past for 12 years became more than just a tale. It became a lesson for everyone who heard it, that true strength often hides in silence, that real heroes don't boast, and that loyalty, courage, and love can live quietly in the heart of even the most ordinary-looking companion.